the theme that runs through everything that I do is storytelling. I think whether you're playing a classical piece or a piece of musical theatre, or whether you're singing a song, you're telling a story, and even when I love watching dance, and one of the reasons that I love watching dance is, first of all, I don't know anything about it, so I can't critique it and I can't comment on it, but it's also storytelling. The dancer is telling a story through what he or she is doing. And that is, I suppose that's the core of what attracts me to art, is the storytelling, the narrative of.
It's so lovely to see you again on Zoom.
Absolutely. It's been a while, hasn't it? I can't remember when the last one we did was. It's got to be a couple of years, 18 months.
Yeah, well, it's long. I think it was just after lockdown.
Yeah.
Because we spoke about this amazing projects that you did during lockdown. But in the meantime, you've really been so busy, and I follow you on Instagram and I see the amazing things that you do.
It's very interesting. I was thinking just before we started the last chat that we had, and the things that we talked about, and it's amazing how the landscape of the entertainment world has changed since then. It's sort of, people sort of often ask, is it back to how it was before the lockdown? And I think the answer is yes, but it's in a different way. I think the attitude of the public and concert going is a little bit different. It's very difficult to explain, but the dynamic is just changed ever so slightly.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because the project that I did during lockdown, I really asked people, what do you think will happen? How will it be afterwards? Do you think people will attend concerts more, or do you think this online business will be more sort of preferred? And so this is interesting that you say that it is the same, yet it's a little bit different than it was.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of joy. There's an element of not taking the live world for granted, because I think we were in this awful place, and it was all taken away from us. And that extends beyond the entertainment world, that, into hospitality, so many people had to restructure their way of life entirely. But I think in terms of a direct impact, I think in terms of musicians, producers, technical production people, lighting, sound, all of that, there was nowhere that they could turn, So I think when the live world did come back, obviously there was that time where we were having to abide by lots of restrictions and social distancing and all of that. But I think now that I think people are still very COVID conscious, as they should be. But I think now it's, that there was that cliche, wasn't there, of it has to become a way of life. And I think that's exactly what has happened. People are still very aware of it. I had COVID again about 6 weeks ago, but you just sort of you move through it, and you sort of carry on and move forward as best you can. But I think, in terms of the live world, I think a lot of shows came back. It's only more recently, though, that tour promoters have had the confidence to invest in big arena tours. I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of one-off shows that were coming back. I mean, as soon as we came out of lockdown, there were a lot of concerts, orchestral concerts, more sort of medium-scale local events, that sort of thing. But if you look at the tour schedules of headline artists and big arena tours like the Hans Zimmer tour, or later this year we're doing our Elvis Live on Screen tour again. And when COVID hit, we were sort of thinking, will this ever come back? Will we ever be able to tour like we did before? And thankfully now I think we are back into a place where we can. So that's good news.
Yeah. But do you think also from an artist point of view that you do things a little bit differently now? You know, that you had this you had this free time really, because everybody that I spoke to said in a way they also enjoyed the time because they could do what they wanted to do, and that year of doing that also was a growth period for an artist to really think about why they're doing it and what they are doing.
Absolutely. I think a lot of creative people they have to immerse themselves into something. They have to have a project to be connected with. And that's where they invest their energy in the present moment. I think when that stops, when that entity that you're investing your energy into is vanished, which is what happened in COVID, I think everyone is then in this sort of free zone. And that, if you use that time in the right way, that is where you can really look inside yourself and be very objective and break everything down. I think that's always the trap that creatives fall into. I think when anything happens that's negative, it turns into this drama. How am I going to cope with this? Oh my gosh, I need to sort this out. Whereas if you use COVID as an example and step back from that immersive idea of always being involved in shows, going from the recording studio to the theatre to then we're going here to do press and then we're doing this. There's always that schedule and you're being governed by that schedule. You know, you're almost a slave to your diary, to your calendar. You know, you're going from this place to this place to this place. And if you want a vacation, you have to actively say, you know, I want this week off. And most of the time, people are still on their phones. They're still doing work. They're still responding to emails. But obviously, COVID gave us that forced time of not having any of that. And I think a lot of people, obviously financially, it was difficult. Of course it was, because the income wasn't there, the work wasn't there. But in terms of looking inside yourself, in terms of your actual being, leaving work out of the picture, you know, giving each person that time to actually reflect and be. It's almost like a sort of everything stops, and then you look inside yourself, and then you sort of say, well, you know, this is what it's like because I can now look at this objectively. How can I break this down? What are the changes that I can make in terms of moving forward in case this happens again, maybe? Or, you know, how can I change elements of my lifestyle? Because a lot of people focused on health and fitness during COVID, particularly in my world, in the musician's world. And, you know, it gave the most precious thing, which is time, you know, and everyone complains, oh my gosh, I don't have time to do this. I don't have time to do that. And I think one of the things we spoke about on our last call was that video, the We'll Meet Again video, where, you know, where we got all the different West End's artists together. And it was, you know, in a normal situation, that would never be possible because nobody would have the time to do that. Whereas it was there was an amazing camaraderie in the industry at the time because everyone wanted to help each other and everyone wanted to come together and spread joy. And I think it was a wonderful time for that. And I really hope, I mean, I certainly took a lot away from it. I operate very differently. Not differently, but I'm very mindful of certain things.
Yeah.
Maybe I wasn't beforehand. And I think that will be true of a lot of people that do the same thing. Yeah.
Well, even now, after all this time, I still speak to people, and sometimes I would ask about a specific project, and the project was born during lockdown. You know, and still now there are things that come from that period. So this is I think must have been also a very creative time for many artists, you know, because they had this rest or this quiet time to really think about things and come up with new ideas. So maybe it was, in a way, something positive came out of it also.
Yeah, I mean, there's the physical entity of, like, going to this place, going to that place. But I think the most important thing is to quieten the mind, and this is a very important thing to do in everyday life if you want to be creative, because that is when you can really, really hone in and allow connection, and allow the soul to connect with what you're trying to create, and allow those channels of inspiration to be open. And I've spoken to a lot of wonderful musicians and creators and artists in the past, as I'm sure you have, about that very topic, about that keeping those channels of inspiration open to allow that inspiration to really take form and create something. For me, it's being by the water. I love to be by the water. I find it a very sort of meditative experience. And it allows me to quieten the mind. You turn the phone off. I think technology can be very helpful, but I think it can be a big distraction as well. So I think getting all that out of the way and really, really listening to your inner voice, I think that's a very, very important way of trying to reach the core of what you're trying to create. And then from there, obviously, once you've got that nucleus of an idea of or whatever that idea may be, you can then use more technical measures to build on that and make it into something else. But I think it was a very, very interesting time. I know a lot of people that had performance anxiety, all of these things, and they really worked on that during COVID, and now they feel a lot more settled in certain aspects of their performance or their writing or their production or whatever it is they do.
But now, Dominic, you grew up in a showbiz world. I mean, your dad was involved in the Beatles, and your mum's also a performer or an artist.
Yeah.
So tell me about this Beatle connection that you have.
Well, here actually, I've got my Abbey Road.
Oh wow!
I have it in my office because my dad worked there for quite a few years, and he was very lucky to work there in, I suppose, what is the golden age of Abbey Road, which is during the time of the Beatles, and he was there during the end of the Beatles recording, because if we think of the Beatles, the actual time that they recorded was only a 7 or 7.5 year period, or 8 or 8 year period. And yet, these songs have gone on to become some of the most legendary songs ever released. And he was there towards the end of that era, so 1970, which was the Let It Be era. So he was there during that time. And some of the recordings for Let It Be were done at a different studio, but they were mixed at Abbey Road, and it was the mixes of those songs that my dad was involved with at Abbey Road. And even when you go into Abbey Road now, I do a lot of sessions there, and you go in there and there's still that. It's amazing how, of the senses, when you think of the different senses, there's the sense of smell, can take you straight back to a place and straight back to a time faster than anything else. It's a very quick trigger. And he says that going back to Abbey Road, there's that element of how it was. And when you go into the studio, like Studio 2, which is the room that the Beatles recorded in, they've kept everything pretty much the same.
Really?
Yeah. It's, and there's still a colleague of my dad's that was there when he was there, who still works there now. His name is Lester Smith. And Lester is the head of microphones. He looks after all the microphones. If something goes wrong with these vintage microphones, he's the one that has to repair them and work it all out, So he occasionally would take us into the studio and say, well, that's where John Lennon stood when he recorded this. This is where Paul McCartney stood. So, yeah, it was, and my mum as well, Glo Macari, she is a singer, still is a singer, and was a songwriter, and she wrote with my dad, Roger, and they wrote for a producer called Mickey Most, who was with Rack Records, and so Rack Studios is actually quite near Abbey Road. It's just a few blocks away in St John's Wood. And Mickey Most was a huge producer in his day, you know, very, very successful, had bands like Hot Chocolate, Suzi Quattro, Smokey, Arrows, and it was actually Smokey and the Arrows that my parents wrote for, and a band called Racy as well. And they had hits in the 70s. And it was a very, very different time in the record industry. I mean, obviously it's changing year on year now, but it was they always say that it was a very magical time of, you know, just going in there and having access to someone that had such an influence on the music industry. And of course, back then, that was the time when, I mean, bands were coming in, but, you know, my mum and dad always talk about the times that, you know, because after my dad worked at Abbey Road, he then went to EMI to become a producer for the record label EMI, which was in Manchester Square in London. And, you know, an artist would come in and he would just arrange an orchestra, and then the next day there would be an orchestra sitting at the studio, you know. So it was, I think that's that's how things were done then, you know. It's obviously changed a lot, but it was amazing influence to grow up surrounded by music. You know, I think I think we talked about this on our last call, but I never really made a conscious decision that I wanted to do music. You know, I never said, right, I'm going to go and train and you know, go to a music conservatoire. It happened very organically, I think. You know, I think the trap that a lot of parents and young people fall into now is that, or maybe this has always been the case, but it just wasn't the case for me. They seem to think there's this formula, you know, you have to do the grades, and then you have to go to music college, and then you have to have a music degree. I mean, in my opinion, that's not the case at all. I think the most important thing is being exposed to the music that you have a passion for, and to have the right people around you, to have the right mentors around you. You know, I think that's key, because that's when you need to make your mistakes at a young age, because I think in your teens and in your 20s, you know, that's when you can make the mistakes that you might not be able to make, or they would have a greater impact if you made that same mistake in your 30s or whatever, when you're in a more established time. So I think I was very lucky to have that pop influence from my parents, and being immersed in the sort of pop genre, the pop way, with a balance between, when I was at school, I was exposed to this wonderful choral music, in English cathedral choral music, which is still my passion.
Really?
I haven't, you know, I don't listen to it very often, but again, that's another trigger for me. You know, when I hear it, it just takes me right back to that time. And I guess I was very lucky to have incredible musical mentors when I was young. One of them, his name is Michael Main. I'm actually seeing him in a couple of weeks. He's coming to be a guest in one of my concerts. And he, you know, he had more of an influence on me, thinking back, than any college, any conservatoire, you know, because it's that one person that's there at the right time. And I had more musical mentors as I was growing up. So he was my first. Then I had another called Nicholas Searles in my teen years. So he was the one that really was focused on technique, because he knew what would be expected of me in a few years' time if I was going to continue music. So he was the one that really, really laid it down and said, look, if you want to do this, we're going to go right back to basics. This is what we need to do. And then when I got to the Royal College of Music in London, which is where I did my music degree, I had another wonderful professor, Nigel Clayton, who again then provides that next stage. So I think every mentor in a young person's life has their part, but they also have their time. And I think the timing is very, very important, because it's the match between the personality and the influence that they can have on a person. But the age of the person that they're mentoring is also very, very important, because if you've got the right mentor but at the wrong time, you might not have the same rapport with them as if they come, you know, at the right time. So that's something that's I was very lucky with. I think I
Well,
had people at the
yeah,
right.
this is what I hear. Well, so often is this mentor, this one person that saw something or that inspired something in an artist. And I actually spoke to a South African pianist, and he told me about his teacher in high school that uh, sort of inspired him and opened up a world of classical music. And by accident, she heard the interview. She never knew this. She never knew that she inspired him, and she heard it then on the interview. So that was so great for me
That's
that she then realized that she was his inspiration.
yeah.
And I think it's so important that these people that come on an artist's way, that they are there, and it's like you say, they have to be there at the right time.
I think so, yeah, yeah. And at the time, like I remember that Nicholas Searles, who I just spoke about, who was my sort of second mentor, if you like. At the time, because I'd come from this world of being mentored by Michael, and Michael Main was it was just this whole world of it. He had a huge personality, very exciting, an impresario. And that was when I was very young, and I was exposed to this whole world of choral music, and he taught me the piano and the church organ, and it was this whole world that was a bit of a fairground. It was just you go into choir rehearsals and sing West Side Story at 9 years old. It's like, oh my gosh, could you have a better introduction to the music industry, and I was very lucky in that sense. But then when I was about age 12 or 13, that's when I changed school from my prep school, St. Christopher's, to my secondary school, college, Hurstpit Point College in mid Sussex. And that was when I started lessons with Nicholas Searles, and he was a very different style of teaching. It was much more strict. It was more focused on technique. And at the time, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not sure if I like this.
Really?
It was very, very tough. And I thought, oh God, I've been given this, Mozart sonata, and I played it in my own way, very flourishy. And then he said, "No, Ferris, it's got to be done." Mozart wouldn't have enjoyed that very much. And so I'm just reliving the moment as I'm talking about it. But at the time, it was tough, but it was all about the molding, and that, in retrospect, looking at the big picture now, it was very clear that he was doing that because he saw the potential in me. He knew that there was, the possibility of me actually getting into a conservatoire in London or whatever, or a university, or playing piano. But he knew that he only had 5 years, because I was only there from 13 to 18. He only had 5 years to prepare me. And I think, although he didn't say it at the time, I think that whole journey was part of that preparation, And by the time I got to 16, our relationship changed. It became much more fluid. It became much more, we'd have a bit of banter. It would be a little bit more of a, not a friendship, but you know what I mean? It wasn't so much of a teacher-student thing. It was much more laid back. We had fun in lessons. We would, I could suggest pieces, and even if he didn't want me to play them, he'd let me play them because he knew that it meant a lot to me. An example of that was Rhapsody in Blue. And actually, talking of Rhapsody in Blue, it's actually the 100th anniversary of Rhapsody in Blue next February.
Really?
Yeah. So Gershwin first performed Rhapsody in Blue. I think it was the 11th of, maybe some of your Gershwin fans can correct me on this, but I think it's February 2020. 1924. So 2024 will be the centenary. But that was the first piano concerto I learnt when I was 17, and I played it with the school orchestra at Hurst, and that was that just started my love for Gershwin, and he's still my hero to this day. Such an innovator. I think with Gershwin, it goes beyond the actual music of what people hear. It's that fusion of classical with jazz, with musical theatre. And that's my whole makeup. Even now, it's that crossover between classical and music theatre and jazz. And he influenced so many that came after him, Stephen Sondheim, Leonard Bernstein. So, yeah, sorry, a bit of a tangent there.
No. But I was thinking now when you said that, it's this is how I was just going to say to you, you were talking about this magical time that your parents had with music, and that must have also influenced you as well, because when I see you play and you behind the piano, you have such a natural and such a relaxed way of playing, and it's very much your personality comes through in the music. Doesn't matter what you're playing, you have this, this almost authority over the piano, which I love. It's you make it look fun and you make it look so easy. And while you were talking now, I was thinking, well, this is where it comes from. I think you had this strict and this sort of reining you in a little bit by this teacher, but you kept this spirit, this free spirit with the music.
Yeah, I think I think the goal is always to make it look easy. I think that should always be the goal of a performance. I mean, I have very individual views about performing and performance. And I think that goes hand in hand with my playing. I mean, the umbrella, the theme that runs through everything that I do is storytelling. I think whether you're playing a classical piece or a piece of musical theatre, or whether you're singing a song, you're telling a story, and even when I love watching dance, and one of the reasons that I love watching dance is, first of all, I don't know anything about it, so I can't critique it and I can't comment on it, but it's also storytelling. The dancer is telling a story through what he or she is doing. And that is, I suppose that's the core of what attracts me to art, is the storytelling, the narrative of, and also sometimes the story is not immediately obvious. Sometimes you have to make up your own story, but whatever's happening is implying a story. Whereas you have some composers that have a very clear story in mind when they're actually composing the work. And that's why I'm always so fascinated in the process. I've always been far more fascinated in the process than the result. I think the result is important. We've got to know where the end line is. We've got to know where the deadline is. But the process, whenever I'm making something or performing something or recording something, it's always the moment in the studio, because then you're in a safe place. You have people around you that you trust. You're in there with your engineer, your producer, and nobody else is hearing this work yet. And it can be changed. If you don't like a take, you can retake it, you can do it again. Obviously, you don't have that luxury in a live performance, but hopefully if you're doing a tour, you can say to yourself, well, I'll do it differently tomorrow, at the next venue. But that's a very, very interesting topic that I like to think about myself sometimes, is that, when you're recording, you have that flexibility of doing it again or doing another take or changing this little bit. But then there comes that I find it a terribly difficult time. I don't know how other artists feel it, but there comes that time when the mix is done and the master's done, and then it's going to go off to be released. It sort of then no longer becomes your property. It's then in the public domain. It's in the big wide world. Everyone will have their opinion about it. But I'm never really interested in that side of it, because all that I'm interested in is me and my piano in the recording studio. When it's released, I completely disassociate myself with it. It's then somebody else's. If they like it, very nice. If they don't, that's absolutely fine. It's no reflection on me, because it's then theirs. It's not mine anymore. In a live perspective, it's a sort of a different struggle, not a struggle, but it's a different experience in the sense that the people that come to a concert, that's the only time that the music will be played like that.
Oh, yeah.
Because if it's a tour, they can come the next day, but it will be a different show. It'll be a different vibe. The audience might be different. If you're outside, it might be colder, it might be warmer. There's all these elements that will make it feel different. So I suppose that's the nice thing about a recording, is that once you've recorded something, it will always be like that. And I think that's why I'm very particular about getting recordings absolutely perfect and the way I want them.
I was going to ask now if you're a perfectionist in that sense.
I think perfectionist is the wrong word, because I don't think that anything can ever be perfect.
Yeah.
But I think that it's got to be, if I have a vision for something, if I'm producing an artist or if I'm working on something of my own, I like to get it as close to that vision as I can. Now, if you're working on your own, you can be very tough on yourself. You can say, come on, Dom, this has got to be better. Let's do it like this. This is not what, you can do it better than this, or you can do it differently. If you're working with another artist, if you're a producer and you're working with another artist, obviously you've got to do your thing if I'm playing for somebody, but then it's a different skill. Then it's, in making that artist be the best that they can be.
Okay, yeah.
And that's a different responsibility, but I always try to get the best out of them. But you just don't know how they're going to be on the recording day. They might be tired. They might have a sore throat. If they're playing an instrument, they might have had a bad morning or whatever. You just don't know. So I think when you're producing an artist, it's the skill of reading the person. It's not just about the music. I think a lot of the trap that a lot of producers fall into is they focus only on the music, whereas the music, I would say, is 25% of the portion of what you're looking at. The rest of it is ensuring that the artist is happy. Do they feel like that it's the best performance that they can give? Allowing them the voice to speak, to voice their concerns. And, when you bring an artist into a studio, they can often feel quite overwhelmed by the situation. Is it okay for me to put my opinion forward? And I think that's very, very important for the same reason, because once that recording is mixed and finished and done, it's much more difficult to then go back and change it. Whereas, if you've got a point, if you've got something that you want to say, you've got to say it there and then, because you can just go in and do another take. It's no problem.
Yeah, but do you think the experience that your dad had was in that situation, or he had that experience? Do you think you've learned from that, or did you get something from that? From because you said it was a magical time that must be in the studio. So, do you try to create that also, that magical time in a studio?
Yeah, I suppose when I was young, I remember sort of, 8, 9, 10 years old, my dad had his studio set up. My mum and dad were recording, and, there'd be the reel-to-reel tape machines, and I'd go in and learn how to lace up to
Really?
put the tape machine on.
Yeah.
And then he would teach me about, if you had a 16-track tape recorder, let's say, this is the button so that the track is armed. If you press record, it will wipe what's on there. Whereas if you press it again, it's safe. So those little things, and he taught me all like how the mixer worked, and the treble, the bass, the EQ, all of these sort of things. So that was a very useful grounding to have, and that teaches you the technical side of it. But then there were other people that taught me how to deal with things on the day. I always use the driving analogy, because when you drive a car, the actual driving of the car is the easy bit, I think. It's everything else that can happen on the day when you drive up to a junction and someone pulls out here and you don't, if you liken that to a studio, the actual working the machines and doing your job, and the technical side of it, of let's go back to bar 24, let's drop in here. That's all. That is the part that you can rehearse. You just do more and more of it. The part that always keeps me interested is working with a new artist, because you don't know what the vibe is going to be like today. You don't know how they're going to be. You don't know what their temperament's going to be like. And in the studio, the artist is always the person that you have to facilitate. So everyone in the studio, the engineer, the producer, you may have to alter your style of how you would normally approach a session in order to facilitate the artist and make sure that you're getting the best performance from them. Because they might not be used to doing 12, 15 takes in a row. They might want to do the song in sections, or they may want to just do a little bit and then come into the control room and listen to it so they can hear what the sound is like. So just little things like that. And that always keeps me fascinated by the recording process. I'm currently working with a lot of young artists, and they all operate in a very, very different way. And once you've been working with them for a while, you sort of, before you go into the session, you think, right, here are the little idiosyncrasies of this artist that you need to be aware of and how they operate. And when you do a 11 or 12 hour recording day, you think, okay, between the hours of 3 and 5, this is normally their lull. So let's not put a really complicated song in that part of the day. Let's either take a break or put something more straightforward in that section. Some artists like to go in with the most complicated thing in the morning and the most technical thing because their mind is most alert. Others like to do that sort of thing in the evening. So those sort of choices are very, very important, and they could even be overlooked. That some producers or whatever come in and think, oh, we'll just record. It's all got to be, for me anyway. I mean, everyone's got their own way of doing things. But to always make sure that I'm putting myself in the shoes of the artist and thinking, how would they like to operate?
Well, I think we should also appreciate recordings more. If I hear what you're saying about all the things that you need to consider and all the, the whole routine. So we just listen to the music, but there's a lot behind it as well, so that we don't really always realize.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's without the what I call the logistics. A producer's role is also booking the studio and handling the budget and all of these things. So I think what back in the day you had a music producer, and then you had somebody that dealt with more of the logistics. Usually the record label would handle that sort of thing. Nowadays, record labels, certainly in this country, tend to have more of a hands-off approach if you're working with an independent artist. So they would say to you, right, well, look, here's the budget, this is the delivery date of the recording, off you go. And then it's up to you which studios you want to book and where you want to go, and so then it's down to the producer to work all that out. But that's how you learn. That it's very enjoyable doing that side of things, because it's. I always think nowadays, in this sort of new world of social media and self-promotion with young artists, when I went to music conservatoire, we were taught about the music, and that's great, but we weren't taught about how to do your tax return and how to find an agent and how to do your concerts and what to do in a recording studio. And all of these things you learn in the big wide world in your 20s, and I think that's what your 20s are for, to immerse yourself in that and be able to make the mistakes that you need to make, so that then when you get to maybe your 30s or whatever, you then feel like you've done enough groundwork to feel confident enough to say, I have a plan, I have a vision, this is what I want to do.
But now, talking about social media, I saw also on Instagram that you sang with your mum. You did a concert with your mum.
Yes.
Amazing. I loved it. But
Oh, she's got a wonderful voice, a wonderful voice. She's been singing a very, very long time. She's worked with some wonderful artists, Tony Bennett, when she was younger, and did some incredible shows alongside her songwriting. And I think that was it was nice to have that balance of my dad more on the recording side, my mum more on the sort of live performance side. And all of my theatrical influence, I think I get from
really?
yeah. Because our whole family, like going back to my grandparents, my great-grandparents, I have this heritage of performance. Like my great-grandparents were in an accordion band in the 1920s, 1930s that used to tour around the UK. They were called Macari and his Dutch Serenaders. And then my grandfather owned a music shop in London called Macari's, which sold the Beatles and all of these incredible bands their first guitars and first guitar amps.
Wow.
So, I think the history of my family is very interesting, and I'm always so interested in each little detail that influenced the next generations.
Yeah. But what is it like to perform with your mum? Because I think sometimes when I do something with my son, he argues with me a little bit, or he tells me, "Oh."
Well, when I was younger, my mum and I used to do a lot of shows together.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, we used to. So she would sing, and I would then go and play the piano to accompany her.
Yeah.
And again, that was all part of, I guess, a great groundwork for me, a great training ground for me to be in front of audiences the whole time. And, you learn what to do, and you learn, more importantly, what not to do. And she provided me with that. She'd say, right, come on, play Unchained Melody, and sing this.
Oh, yeah.
And it was all playing, and then it was singing. But obviously, I think the video you saw was she was singing a Cole Porter number every time we say goodbye.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And I was playing and it's great. I mean, that was actually filmed on a ship. I play on a ship, a seaborne cruise line.
Oh, okay.
I go on there from time to time, and just for a week at a time, and I go on there and do a couple of shows. And she came on, and I was halfway through my show, and I say, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Glo Macari." And she came up, and
amazing! Your mother is a stunning woman, really.
Yeah, she's. I think what's really interesting about having that influence is that you get introduced to lots of different styles of music at a very young age. And I think that is very, very important to be a rounded musician, because a lot of my peers, a lot of my contemporaries were studying very intensely, but on a single genre, whether that be classical or whether that be jazz or music production in pop music. But one thing influences the other. There's a vertical intensity for each genre, but there's also a huge horizontal crossover for each genre, because one thing influences the other. If you listen to some of the early ABBA recordings, some of the early Beatles recordings, they are all influenced by music that happened maybe the generation before. And this is a lot of the influence that I have taken from my parents and from other mentors. I have had mentors that were very specific to a particular genre, and then you know that you're not going to be immersed in that genre, but you take what you need, you take what you can. Obviously, they would be at a much higher level in that genre than I am, because they're a specialist. But you would understand what you can, and then use that and integrate that with other genres. And that's always fascinated me, like that show that Gloria, my mum, performed in. We'd do a number like that, and then I would then go and play a classical piece or something else. You know, I think that crossover of genres is a very important for yourself, not necessarily for a public facing perspective, but for yourself, for your musical soul to explore these different colors, these different flavors in the music. I think that's very, very important. Yeah.
But do you still have a preference? Is there still something where you think, okay, this genre is something that I really enjoy much more to play?
Well, to play and to listen to are two different things.
Yeah.
I think we talked about choral music earlier, English cathedral choral music. I think when you're young, you know, obviously the wiring in your brain and how that wiring is formed, you know, you're very impressionable to the people that are influencing you around you. And when I was young, I had this enormous impression on English cathedral music through my mentor, Michael. And every week we were singing different anthems, settings. And when I hear it now, which is very rare because you don't go out and about, you know, you're not out in a cafe and suddenly, Stanford or Parry would come on the, I think it's music that you have to go to. It's not going to come to you. You have to go to it. And I remember those days of singing in a choir. And I think when you do sing in a choir, that in itself teaches you a huge amount, because especially if you're singing a cappella, because you're listening to the parts around you, and you're, you know, in a choir, say you're doing, I don't know, SATB harmony, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, you know, and you're a soprano. Obviously, if you're the top line, then that's lovely, and you're singing the melody, you're singing the tune, but you've got these underparts that are anchoring the harmony underneath you. And I think when you're young, it's subconscious. You don't really realize how much education you're getting by listening to that. I think it's, you know, you're just thinking, oh, this is the harmony, I'm just singing the melody. Yeah. But then when you move to the, you know, as your voice changes and you're not so young anymore, you might move to the alto line or the tenor line or even the bass line. And then you appreciate then that you are almost in a choral sandwich, and you've then got the treble line, the soprano line above you, and yet now you have to hold your own line. But because you've had that experience of singing in a choir as a young treble for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, it completely changes the approach to the thing. But listening, I think everything is to do with listening. I think that's the single most important thing. In terms of playing music, I don't have a preference at all. I think if I was to have a preference, I think it would upset the balance of what I do. I think we're often led by opportunity in the sense that, you know, if I'm producing an artist, that artist might be au fait with a certain style. Like some of my artists are quite crossover in their genre, so it's a classical influence but with a poppy approach.
Okay, yeah.
So I then need to go into that genre. If I'm practicing for a concert, you know, I would prepare in that genre. I don't really play at home, to be honest with you. I don't.
Oh, really?
No. I like silence is important to me as
That's
the music.
Interesting, yeah.
Because it goes back to that whole thing of quieting the mind, and I think if your mind is empty, that's when the inspiration can come. Obviously, if I'm working something out or if I'm doing something, or sometimes, you know, I'll pour a glass of wine and, you know, late at night and I'll try something out. But those times are rare. I have to be feeling it at the time.
Okay. But you were talking now about the choral music, and actually, I lived in Windsor for 7 years, yeah, and I used to go to the St. George's Chapel there at Windsor Castle, and they had 5 o'clock. that evening song. I didn't go every afternoon, but many afternoons I went because the choir was singing, and that was so relaxing to listen to. And I found it really in that that the acoustic and the sound and this choral music was really for me always so relaxing. I always felt as if I went to a spa or something, that feeling of when you come out. So it's actually, so true what you're saying about the choral music.
Yeah, I think it for me it's all to do with fusion, because talking of that rounded approach to music, I think that's, I don't know if it's unique, but I do have colleagues that are quite paralleled in their interest to mine, but they're very few. I know a lot of specialists in fields, so classical specialists, jazz specialists, pop production specialists, and if you're making, if you've got a vision that you want to create, you want to bring those people in to assist you, to get their expertise in that particular field. But I think if you're the nucleus of a project, which I tend to be when I'm producing other artists or if I'm doing my own work, I think having a rounded approach allows you to take that influence from the choral music and fuse it if you're doing a pop production. But you know enough about that side of things in terms of operating software and what sounds to use and how to work the rhythm section. It's all to do with that fusion of different styles. Then, of course, there's the musical theatre, which is a different style again. I used to be a lot more involved with music theatre than I am now. I used to play a lot of shows, and that, again, storytelling and how to structure a story, because a song in a musical, the purpose of a song is to explore the character or to move the plot forwards, and that taught me a lot about structure in terms of how to structure a musical piece, and if you look inside of the music in a musical, it's not just the song and the lyrics that move the story along or associate with a character. It's also the instrumentation and the color of the music. I mean, Stephen Sondheim is the master of that. If you look at some of his early work, Company Follies, you can really see a picture painting going on in the instrumentation and the orchestration of the work, which gels perfectly with the sentiment of the narrative that is happening at that time. So that was a very, very exciting 15-year period to explore. I still do music theatre. I still get involved with shows, but it tends to be more now in an advisory and creative capacity rather than going to perform a musical or going to conduct a musical, let's say. But I still enjoy it. I still like listening to more obscure works that maybe could have deserved more commercial success that didn't.
Oh, is it?